Hello, welcome to the Completed Life May Lunch Hour. My name is Sarah Kiskaden-Bechtel, and I am the Program Director for the Completed Life Initiative. The Completed Life Lunch Hour series is an opportunity to have an up-close and personal discussion with our experts about what it means to live a completed life. Those lucky enough to have full access to medical treatments may already feel their lives are quote-unquote completed and might want to skip a period of increasing debility late in life by choosing the time of their own death. What might be the criteria for making such a choice? And what methods to achieve death might be permissible? Furthermore, what options might be available to those who have lost decision-making capacity? These questions are profound and difficult. Our lunch hours offer the Completed Life community, you and our audience, and you watching the recording later on, the opportunity to join this conversation with our Completed Life faculty and special guests. Today's lunch hour features guest speaker Danielle Spencer, PhD, academic director of the Columbia University Narrative Medicine Program. And she is the author of the newly released book, Metagnosis, Revelatory Narratives of Health and Identity, published by Oxford University Press this year of 2021. Metagnosis identifies and names the phenomenon of metagnosis, the experience of learning in adulthood of a long-standing condition. One such condition which we all share, and which can come into sudden, sharp awareness, is our mortality. When dementia and end-of-life issues arise, they have, in a sense, been there all along, but many of us remain unaware of them until that point. I'm also delighted to welcome back Professor David Hoffman, who is an esteemed member of the Completed Life Advisory Board, as well as Columbia University lecturer in bioethics and chief compliance officer at Carthage Area Hospital. David was recently on our speaker panel last week for the April town hall with David Grunwald. So welcome back, David. Welcome, Danielle. It's an honor to have you both here joining us in conversation for today's lunch hour. So without further ado, I will turn it over to you, David, to get us started.
Well, thank you, Sarah, and welcome everyone. And Danielle, welcome back to the Completed Life Initiative programming, which is really designed to broaden the conversation that we are able and willing to have about issues related to end-of-life decision-making and really how each of us can and ought to define for ourselves what is a completed life. And for those of you who were present for our Completed Life Initiative inaugural conference, you'll remember Danielle, she and I were in conversation about the relationship between narrative medicine and narrative ethics, which are the two sides of a coin that represent our respective professional and academic disciplines. And so I'm really thrilled, beyond thrilled, to have a chance to talk about Danielle's new book, Metagnosis. And Sarah, why don't we put up the first slide, or actually the second slide, while we talk about this really quite remarkable book. Now, you would all expect me to say that the book is remarkable, because otherwise, why would I have asked Danielle to be here to talk to our Completed Life community? But this book is remarkable in not one and not two, but actually three entirely different ways. And this is my endorsement, more on that to come. This is a remarkably researched piece of scholarship. So if you're into footnotes, this is a book for you. It is also a quite remarkable personal narrative. It is a memoir of metagnosis for Danielle. And so we're going to talk about that. And we're going to talk about my metagnosis experiences, both ancient and current. And finally, it is just a truly, truly original piece of thinking reduced to this paper, right? So the privilege and the courage to create a new word is astounding. To do so in a way that crosses these disciplines of narrative ethics, medicine, narrative medicine is really quite remarkable. How remarkable? Well, let me tell you how remarkable. I'm going to read from the back of the cover jacket from Danielle's and my teacher of narrative medicine, and in fact, the person who created narrative medicine as a clinical discipline, Rita Charon. Rita writes, Metagnosis is masterful, original, filled with electric thinking, sparking, glinting, illuminating corners so dark we didn't know that they were there. In today's storytelling fever, all who tell and listen to stories need deeply perceptive guides who provide conceptual and practical frameworks for interpreting narratives' complexities. And who better to do that than Danielle Spencer? So, Danielle, let's get started with a definition. Next slide, please, Sarah. Actually, the second after, slide 3, there we go. And I'll start with the obvious question. When someone creates a brand new word and a brand new concept and a brand new way of thinking, Danielle, what is metagnosis?
David, thank you. First, let me just say how thrilled I am to be here. I have so much respect for this organization and the work you all are doing. And it's a particular joy to be here in conversation with David. We've been colleagues in 2 different academic programs for many years. We're both in bioethics, and I'm in narrative medicine, and have a lot of common interests. And so it's such a privilege to continue this conversation, but in a public way with all of you as well. So the definition is here, but I did make it up. Now, I didn't do it lightly. I worked on this project for a while, and I did not have a name for this phenomenon, and it was a struggle. And so I coined this neologism by putting together meta and gnosis to describe something that didn't have a name. So as you can see from the slide, the roots are meta. One of the senses of the prefix meta is change, and then gnosis for knowledge, or the process of knowing. And I define it as, in the strict medical sense, as what happens when somebody learns about a long-standing condition they didn't know about before. So not exactly when you know you have a problem, but you just can't get a proper diagnosis or diagnosis and treatment. There's a lot of overlap, and we're going to talk about that. But strictly speaking, in this definition, it's when you're not aware that you might have a so-called condition. And this can happen in one or both of the following ways. The first is simply because it was never detected. This happened to me. I had a visual field defect that was detected when I was well into adulthood. Had it been tested for, simple visual field test when I was a child, it would have been detected. The other, but I wasn't aware of it, so it came as a shock to me. The other way in which it can happen is when the diagnostic boundaries themselves have changed. So we see this a lot with conditions like ADHD, Asperger syndrome, or autism spectrum disorders, where the diagnostic boundaries have expanded considerably in recent decades. And so a classic example would be when somebody's child is diagnosed with one of these conditions, like ADHD. And they say, oh, that's interesting. I was exactly the same way when I was my child's age, which means I would have been diagnosed. Moreover, I still am this way, which means I have this condition, and yet, and wasn't aware of it. And then it can also be understood more broadly when you think about other kinds of revelations, like genetic revelations concerning genealogy. And also, as we'll discuss today, I think it really does apply to a newfound awareness of a condition which has been there all along for all of us, which is our mortality. So that's the basic definition.
Yeah, and I'm really most interested in what lies between the medical and the identity definitions, A and B, because really that's where the notion of metagnosis can enable us to make better, more insightful decisions about how we want to complete our lives. When you discover that there's more to understand about the way you've been living that can inform what plans you want to make and how you want to approach the end of your story, right? And since
Yeah.
we are all stories in the making, this is quite remarkable. And I, as I was reading the book, found the medicine part very familiar. The identity part was quite startling in all good ways. And as I mentioned, I now understand that I've had two metagnostic experiences, one very early in my life, some of my earliest memories, and one literally last Friday. So we're going to talk about that. But can we go to the next slide, Sarah? So Danielle, tell us about the origami unicorn, because I'm an origami enthusiast, albeit a rank amateur. And so I was thrilled to see the origami unicorn as the symbol of the cover of the book. And can you explain this?
Yes, happily. So, and just to underline what you said a moment ago, that the identity aspect is integral. So even though in the definition, the first one says medicine, and it pertains to this kind of belated diagnosis, right? So this is what I'm calling metagnosis. But what I'm interested in is exactly how this new knowledge intersects with one's sense of identity. And that's really, the book is exploring that using a lot of different ways in. Because when somebody gets a precipitous revelation like that in adulthood, then the question of how that informs their identity, whether it's realizing that one is not neurotypical or some other condition, is an open question, and people respond in a variety of ways, right? Sometimes somebody might say, well, that's immaterial. I mean, I am who I am and I've adapted. People might be really relieved. They might be resistant in some ways to being pathologized, or a combination of those reactions all at the same time. So it evinces a lot of issues that are pertinent, that are part of identity. So the origami unicorn is a little detour I take, but I think an important one in the book, to looking at speculative fiction, and in particular Blade Runner, the film from the 80s. This is a bit of a spoiler alert, except that it's not, it's sort of an uncertain spoiler, which is that in short, the main character in the movie, played by Harrison Ford, his name is Deckard, his job as a so-called Blade Runner is to try to hunt down replicants who are android humans, but otherwise indistinguishable from humans, and to eradicate them. And then in the last scene of the movie, what this unicorn represents, and I'm holding up, this is actually what I used to create the cover of the book. I bought it on Etsy, and somebody had replicated the origami unicorn from Blade Runner pretty precisely. When he picks it up, what that indicates is that he himself might actually be a replicant as well, because he's had dreams of a unicorn, and then one of his fellow replicant hunters leaves this origami unicorn in his hallway, meaning that these memories may have been implanted, which is what they do with replicants. Anyway, we don't have to get into the weeds on the science fiction stuff, but the ideas I explore in this film and in other narratives in the genre, these stories of characters who learned something about themselves that was true all along, but that they didn't know. And then how do they receive that knowledge, and how does that actually change the terms of knowledge? So remember, metagnosis, a change in knowledge. So in this case, for the spectator of Blade Runner, at the very end of the film, in the director's cut, you face the possibility that this character might actually be a replicant. But what it also does is it changes your understanding of whether or not it's important that a character is materially human or a replicant. So it's a change in knowledge. And just to circle back, when it involves a condition that one is living with, then often it prompts people to reevaluate those terms of normalcy, impairment, disability, difference, because from one moment to the next, they've been moved from one category to another, right? So it not always, but it sometimes prompts them to think about those terms. And I think we can stop with the slides now, because we set a very short deck until the end.
Absolutely. So we will leave the science fiction conversation in a moment because otherwise it would take up all of our time, and as well it should. If you haven't seen Blade Runner, don't watch it just once. Watch it at least 3 times. It's that much to absorb. I would just add, to tie that to our conversation, one of the statements by Arthur C. Clarke, the very, very famous science fiction writer. He observed that any technology sufficiently developed is indistinguishable from magic. And I would apply that notion to your notion of metagnosis as a technology, as an intellectual technology, because it really is quite remarkable and quite startling when you understand how valuable metagnosis as a tool is and start applying it to your life. As I said, and as we will discuss, it literally happened to me on my way driving home last Friday from New Paltz in ways that I'm getting some good value out of. All right, so as a teacher, I have to circle back to define some terms because I don't want to leave our class, our audience, our community in the dark. You use the phrase neurotypical. So please explain where neurotypicality fits into this conversation.
Yes, neurotypical would describe people who fall within the quote unquote normal range of the spectrum in terms of neurological function. And it's usually used to describe that group of people in contrast to folks who have conditions like autism spectrum disorders. And even the term disorder is somewhat vexed. So in disability studies and disability activism, a lot of these terms are interrogated. And so one of the strategies is to name that every category, every point along the spectrum has a name. It's not just that you don't need to be named unless you're somehow other, because then you're only named if you're not in the norm, but the norm range, which is also problematic, but that's, so you usually hear it, I think, in autism spectrum contexts. Yeah.
But in reality, part of the insight that we can all gain from your work is that normal is highly overrated as a word and as a concept, and maybe is of limited or no value at all. But we'll get back to that later.
Well, it is actually deeply problematic because I mean, this is, if we dig a little deeper, then it's linked to eugenics. It's linked to many abuses toward people who fall outside the norm. And this is related to the question of what does it mean to be a human, which is interrogated in films like Blade Runner, because it's intertwined with ethical considerations. Because you ask, well, why is this important? Like, why does it even matter what is considered, which living things or beings are considered to be human and which aren't? In any given context that you're asking that question, there are ethical consequences to it. And in speculative fiction plays out those consequences in a way that's kind of circumscribed, which is, and then helpful to look at that and then come back to our, real world scenarios.
What I really found enjoyable in reading your book and starting to wrap my mind around metagnosis as a tool for engaging in clinical bioethics consultation is this, what you just described, this very notion that you can get to know yourself better along a variety of different parameters, some of which can be pathologized, turned into a disease state, some of which are just gaining insight so that you know what you're capable of and therefore what you want to accomplish before you decide that the burdens outweigh the benefits, which is a decision that we all need to make individually. So, for me, having an insight into my late in life ADHD diagnosis and my more recent diagnosis this past Friday about my hip, which we will get into in a moment, is less important than the insights that I've gained from my work about just my nature and personality, including my complete lack of ability to appreciate, to quote a friend who's with us, Judy, that no is a complete sentence. It just, that's a notion that I've struggled with, which is why I spread myself so thin. But this is, for me, a good sense of a way to live a complete life. Hence, for me, that's normal. So
Well, David,
let's
would you like
dive in.
you've been teasing us with telling us you're going to share your metagnostic stories. So would you? I'd love to hear about them.
Absolutely. So the funny thing, when you and I were preparing for our talk today, I recounted to you one of my earliest academic memories, which is my report card in grade school, which, and I have them in a little book up in the closet because my mother kept everything. It's in every one of my report cards. It says, David is not working up to his potential. He can't stay in his seat. And I just thought, that was my personal defect in the eyes of my teachers. But in the early to mid 1960s, that's about as far as that went. It was a report card comment, observation. One that has clearly marked me, probably in both good and bad ways, but so be it. Decades later, in the course of my therapy, because I'm a lawyer in New York, and all lawyers in New York, and most everyone else I think in New York has had the benefit of therapy. My therapist said to me, Ellen said quite matter of factly, "Well, yeah, that's ADHD, and that's who you are." And it was a kind of relief, right? I have always known that my mind races, that I think best literally and figuratively on my feet. But the notion that this corresponded with the experience of lots of other people, and that there was a name for it, was sort of intriguing. It was just a curiosity at first, but it's become more significant. To your point about pathologizing things, I see the ADHD, those four letters, part of the diagnosis, as only half the story, because as anyone who has ADHD and is aware of the way it impacts their personality and their functioning, they'll tell you it's an enormous gift, because the ADHD part of it belies and really obscures the ability to think very quickly and to process information and to consume ideas and turn them into something new. And so I'm kind of happy about that.
Yes,
I can't
and
imagine being me without that.
yeah, well, it's really beautifully put that you can't imagine being me without that. And there's a literature of people who've had these revelations with ADHD, and that another way of describing the plus side too is that people are guided by their interests, and that this is actually an important trait, not to simply do things because you're told. So it makes you a little bit maladapted to a conventional school setting. But if we zoom out and think about what are good adaptive traits to have in life, if you're fortunate enough to follow your interests, then it can certainly be an advantage.
Absolutely, and I've always thought that the hyperactivity part of the definition should have come before the attention deficit part of the definition, because it's that hyperactivity, that mind racing and focusing, that produces the disinclination to spend a whole lot of time on any one topic. That's the deficit, the attention deficit. But so be it. Interesting that you jump from my early childhood, now I understand it to be a meta-diagnostic or metagnostic revelation in my late 30s, that I am part of this community of people labeled with these four letters ADHD, to this past Friday, because I put my body through a lot, and I have always known that there would be a price to pay for that, that I'd probably wear my bones out quicker than people who are more sedentary. And yet, when I went to a holistic physical therapist, hello, Shelley, um, because of this pain and lack of mobility, lack of flexibility that I've had, especially in my right leg and hip flexor. And she was able to, in the course of just a couple of hours, provide remarkable change in the functioning of my skeleton that opened up more possibilities, right? That redefined what ought to be part of my completed life. I, for example, aspire to climb the Matterhorn, which is something that I thought I had lost the flexibility to achieve. Well, now I've maybe gotten a little bit of that back because of holistic physical therapy. But then on the rest of the drive home, I get a call from my doctor. Hello, Joshua, um, who had the report of the MRI that I had done at one of my hospitals upstate just that morning at 8:45. That lo and behold, quite startling, I have profound osteoarthritic changes in the ball and socket of my right hip. So there's a part of me that is in fact worn out. Maybe that suggests I won't ever climb the Matterhorn, although I'm hopeful that modern medicine will keep that door open for me. So how does that fit into the value, the function of metagnosis, Danielle?
Well, I think that these two examples are really helpful to us because they fall at different places along the spectrum. And this is where I think there is a spectrum of these kinds of experiences. And this is also where we can start talking about how end of life awareness of end of life issues and is part of that spectrum. So on the one hand, you had in my view kind of like a classic metagnostic experience with the ADHD reveal, and there's a section in the book where I talk about it, and it's very moving to people when they have these revelations. Each one is unique. It often opens up different possibilities for self-understanding. On the whole, people are happy to have these revelations because often they've carried so much shame and internalized guilt from them being told. I mean, how can you not being told all through your childhood and your life that you're just not, you're lazy or you're just bad. And so then to have an explanation for it is double-edged, but often people are very happy to have it. And then the example of your hip and the physical side of things. Well, first of all, I'm really glad to hear that you got some more insight. I hope you're able to climb the Matterhorn. Um, and that's a little more toward, I would have said earlier when I was working on this project, oh, well, that's not what I'm thinking of as metagnosis, because you knew you had a problem, like you had physical difficulties, you knew you had a problem, and that, so unfortunately it's very widespread, but that's a little different from this other situation where you had no inkling that the way that, you were, the way that you thought or your attention was different from the norm, and then you had this revelation. But as we're talking about it, it prompts me to consider that there really is a spectrum, because when you have a revelation about a physical condition, even if you were aware that there was something going on, that knowledge can be transformative. And then here's really one of the key things. Okay, it might happen once, like you just described an instance where you got, when you, like you said, you saw the holistic physical therapist and you got a revelation about what might be possible for you physically. And then, an hour later, or however, the same day, you got another revelation. Once this happens, it's significant on its own terms because you get this information that might really change your understanding of yourself and your body. But it's deeper than that, because once it happens once, it means it could happen again. It could always happen again. And it changes our understanding of selfhood as being more fluid. So in the speculative fiction examples, a character can have a revelation that he's actually not a human, but a robot. But the point is, it could happen again. He could then find out that actually he is a human. And in fact, in the Blade Runner sequel, that's one of the things that happens. And it happens a lot in the genre, that once the terms of knowledge are shown to be movable, then they can keep moving. So that understanding of the spectrum, then our hope, the hope is that by bringing this into connection with end of life issues is to see them as being along the spectrum, that it's not some distinct other set of issues, that it's an awareness of one's own mortality, and awareness that making end-of-life decision making and deciding what is a completed life for oneself is pertinent to oneself. I mean, I am middle-aged. I have not yet really accepted that for myself. I know it conceptually. I mean, I teach it, you know, I'm around people who talk about it all the time, but I haven't really, I'm still, you know, denial is not just a river in Egypt. And so I know ahead of me in life is a process in which I will come to a different form of awareness of my relationship to my own mortality, right? And it's not a switch that gets flipped. I mean, it's a process, and it's ever changing. And so if we can put that process in the context of, because you might be asking, what does ADHD have to do with the completed life, right? If we can understand that process of awareness and changing awareness and growing awareness and what is helpful to the individual and their community, if we can understand that in relation to a host of other things that happen in life, then maybe it makes it a little less frightening, you know, a little less other, and a little more approachable, and something that we can name and talk about and try to understand better, which is what we're trying to do here. Yeah, go ahead.
Absolutely. And let me say, this is a valuable tool for people who practice clinical ethics as I do, and are in consultation with patients and family members who are trying to make sense out of new information, oftentimes about physical experiences that have been part of them for years, decades, a lifetime, but which they now have to process. In fact, this discussion, and it's just wonderful the way our area of scholarship and clinical practice overlaps and intermixes so easily. Tonight we're having a program at Columbia in the bioethics program, actually a continuing legal education program on bioethics mediation that is designed to help people make sense out of difficult situations, and to help clinicians and patients, or clinicians and family members, make sense out of what is within the realm of possibility, so that what external constraints need we accept or recognize that will influence what constitutes a completed life for a given patient. And we'll be talking about a few consults that I've done over the years to try to make sense out of how helping a patient understand what their limitations are, what the name is for those limitations, that metagnostic process, and then using that to define what benefits do I still reasonably expect, and at what cost, what burden should I shoulder. So where else do you see metagnosis becoming applied to the work that we both do?
Well, I think just to add to what you were just saying, that recognition itself, that these changes, these revelations, these decisions do really indicate a change in one's sense of self. Understand the significance of that, and we should pause over that, because once that's acknowledged, that's enormously important and helpful, because I think a lot of times these are it could be approached as, okay, well, here's this decision that you have to make, or the family makes, or, you know, you have to make for oneself. And it's practical, and do you want this or that, and, you know, what are your choices for, you know, if this were to happen, do you want this intervention? Um and but of course it's not a simple practical question for most people, because it evinces, you know, it evokes these fundamental, the presence of mortality, and perhaps suffering of a different nature, and how to alleviate that, and how one's sense of self is changed or mediated by those physical changes. I just went through this with my parents, and having this discussion with somebody who's on this call who helped us a great deal, and introduced what was unspoken in the conversation with my parents, which were some of the existential aspects of that. that it wasn't, well, I'll just say it's Judy. I see you right there. Who brought that into conscious awareness in the conversation with enormous sensitivity, because Judy, that that's part of it, and we had never had that conversation before, and you were able to help it become spoken, even just a little bit, which was an enormous achievement. And if that's acknowledged, that all those aspects of self and the self is changing, then I think that opens up, it doesn't make it easy. These are enormously challenging conversations and decisions, but takes away perhaps some of the fear overlay, or the sense that, oh, this is this other thing that we can't talk about because it's so terrifying.
Yes, anyone who doesn't know Judy Schwartz of End of Life Choices New York, you should get to know her. She's a force of nature in all of the best ways, and is really a practitioner who has taken this notion, which you have now given a name to, and it applied it to helping people define and decide how to complete their life for decades. So what does this tell us about the usefulness of your word, your term, going forward? Where do you think this is leading?
Well, I think that, now that the book is out, there's this fascinating stage of how it comes alive in the world and how people respond to it, which I was really looking forward to, also because writing a book is a really difficult and isolating experience. But actually, one of the inspirations for the book was Andrew Solomon's Far from the Tree, and Parents, Children, and the Search for Identity, and which I recommend highly. He also is exploring in a different way, but he's exploring the intersection between illness and identity by looking at a lot of conditions, specific conditions. And this book has had an extraordinary, well, I could say afterlife, or life as it came to life. As
Pun intended, right?
Yes, exactly. As people in these communities and others responded to it, and so even my book came out a few months ago, and as people have started to read it, and it is, somewhat dense and different in a lot of ways. But as people who read it, sometimes circle back to me and say, well, what about this? And I'm fascinated by that. And there are a lot of things I don't talk about in the book that I do think can be understood in this framework. So, for example, I don't talk about trauma, because I think that trauma is something that has to be understood on its own terms. But the notion that you could recover some kind of awareness of a trauma that you've suffered. So maybe this would be, in the psychotherapeutic context, or, and then that awareness, might be really unwelcome in some ways, but it changes one's sense of self. Also, these genetic revelations, which I touch upon in the book, which are increasingly common, from genetic paternity revelations to revelations that one's geographic origin doesn't correspond to what one considers to be one's ethnic or racial identity, even though race is not a biological category. But there are a lot of people who face these questions. And I think on a societal level too, you can understand, we can think about how our society has had a long-standing disease of systemic racism, for example, and yet some of us have been only too painfully aware of that all along. Some of us are becoming newly aware of that, but it's a retrospective revelation, right? So
Very
there's a
much. All of those,
yeah,
all of those marches and protests last summer were a moment of revelation for large segments of the otherwise self-identified as enlightened part of the white population of this country, right? That was a realization that was startling and mind-changing for lots of people.
right. But as with the other examples of metagnosis that we've discussed today, it affects a change in the terms of knowledge, because alongside that revelation comes a set of questions like, what is it that that prevented many people in society from having that awareness, and then thinking about how structures militate against that awareness. And it's not by any means a simple question. So change in knowledge in the sense of not just it was there and I didn't realize it was there, but also how is that possible that it remained occult to to many empowered people for so long, right?
Yeah. You know, I want to move on to page 309 of the book about the realization of knowledge through genetic testing. But you said something that just got my mind racing. Surprise, surprise, right? My mind. When you referenced Andrew Solomon, because it just occurred to me, his work is in fact the inverse of metagnosis, or metagnosis working in the opposite direction, because he has in his work and in his writing explored homosexuality as a defining characteristic and a social stigmatization, especially within families, that can be incredibly harmful. And what his work has really brought to our attention is the depathologization, that's a mouthful, of homosexuality, which is well, let me ask it as a question. Is that an inverse metagnostic event? Is that in effect
Yeah,
metagnosis
I
working in reverse?
I think so. I've never considered it in quite that way, and I should acknowledge Andrew as he was the advisor for my master's thesis years ago, which was a nascent version of this project, and was deeply supportive of it, even though he was tremendously busy publishing Far from the Tree at the time, which, as you can see, was quite a tone. But I think one of the reasons why um, he agreed to work with me at the time was because we both recognized that these two topics were getting at the same issues, but from different directions. And so, yeah, exactly, David. I mean, he in his book, he's interested in what he calls horizontal versus vertical identity. So vertical identity would be familial.
Mhm.
The identity I share with my parents or whoever raised me, right? And horizontal identity is when you have children who have a quote unquote condition that differs from their family of origin, then very often there's a horizontal identity of affinity between people who share that condition, whether it's folks who are not neurotypical or people who have Down syndrome, and then he expands that in the book and he talks about children who have, for example, prodigious talent, prodigies, and
Mhm.
also more, in complicated way, looking at children who are born of rape, for example, and really trying to explore this question of illness and identity and family and how they intersect. But you're absolutely right. So all the conditions that he's looking at are very manifest, and that's the challenge that's posed to that family, is this question of how to navigate this manifest um, illness or disability or impairment or difference from the norm, vis-a-vis identity for the individual and for the family, right? And in the case that you're describing, yeah, I mean, and Andrew talks about this too, that over the course of his life, the implications of being gay have changed dramatically, right? Um, and whereas I'm coming at it from the other direction, saying, well, if you have a thing, but you just wasn't manifest, or wasn't manifest in a way that could be recognized, and then you realize it, then what are the implications? But they're the same issues at root, which has to do with identity vis-a-vis conditions. And again,
Mhm.
thinking about the completed life, um, that's identity vis-a-vis conditions, the condition being mortality, or the condition
Mhm.
being the set of
Right.
specific medical conditions that attend mortality for many of us.
Or that are in place as we approach points of decision, right?
Yes.
Not part of the central premise of the completed life and the completed life initiative is that each person, as a descriptive matter and as a normative or an ethical matter, has to decide for themselves what is their sense of a completed life. it would be abhorrent for anyone to decide someone else's life is completed other than in the strictly physiologic medical futility sense. But the insights that metagnosis brings to your sense of possibility toward the end of your life, when the burdens become more obvious and more present, my hip just being a very small, simple example, and at the same time, the benefits becoming so much more valuable, right? A year of life when you're in your 20s is an abstraction. A year of life when you're 101 and a half. My next door neighbor and dear friend, Walter Bernstein, died just a few months ago at 101 and a half. And I can tell you that that last year of his life was remarkable for me and for him, though he had to decide what burdens to bear as he decided what pain medication to take and what risks to expose himself to just in walking down our front lawn, which was at a rather steep angle. These are more weighty decisions when you understand that each risk analysis can have far more profound consequences.
Yes, and if I there's another although we center as we should the individual's right to make their determination for their own life and their own completed life. One of the other things that's common to thinking about metagnosis, you know, on one end of the spectrum, and then also when it comes to this end of life, is that those decisions, that situation is never made in pure isolation, right? That we are, I mean, there's within bioethics, there's a school that grew out of feminist bioethics, which is, yes, autonomy, yes, we should still respect autonomy, but to understand it as being fundamentally relational. So relational autonomy, that yes, I should make these decisions for myself, but that I exist within a matrix of family and friends and all kinds of clinicians, right?
And those provide both benefits and additional burdens
Right.
to the process of managing yourself. In fact, the first case study that I'll present tonight in our bioethics mediation program focuses on the presence and absence of family members, on what options are available to someone who has profound life-limiting conditions, both physical and from a behavioral health perspective. And I think metagnosis speaks to that. And what's fun and what is racing through my mind right now as we're talking is all of the ways that, like Andrew Solomon's work about homosexuality, all of the ways that metagnosis can influence the way you do the work that didn't occur to me until literally 5 minutes ago. So
Yeah,
that's
I think,
exciting.
and it can be helpful also, like when you're looking at a particular issue, it can be helpful to have something that's complementary, but it's not exactly the same thing, because then you're not locked into that particular situation. That's one of the reasons why I bring in speculative fiction, right? Because, and in this case, you know, the fact that when you have your midlife revelation that you actually have ADHD and you've had it all along. I mean, we didn't really have time to get into this, but you would have talked to your family about it. They would have had reactions. They would have, you know, you would have a context for receiving that information. In fact, in a lot of cases, like one example that I talk about in the book, of a man who realized in midlife that he had Asperger's syndrome, as it was then described. It was his wife. His marriage was foundering, and his wife found one of these online quizzes. She prompted him to take it, and he informally self-diagnosed as having Asperger's syndrome, i.e. being on the autism spectrum. And he wrote a memoir about it, and the memoir is very much couched in, when he had this revelation, he said, oh, great, maybe I can save my marriage. In other words, it was profoundly relational because we are relational beings. And so then when you bring this back to this question of end-of-life decision-making, to acknowledge that as a starting point, that these decisions are not made in a vacuum, nor should they be.
And we are gaining ever more information about what we can do with this information. So I see Sarah popped back up in our world. Hi, Sarah. And I know there are probably questions that we should get to, but I'm going to ask for 2 more minutes of indulgence before we take a break for questions, because 309, page 309 of the book, you'll read this book and your mind will race, even if you don't have ADHD, to all of the different places where we can wind up. And so page 309, Danielle, you quote the disclaimer, something that we lawyers just live for, from 23andMe, the genetic testing company. And there's a line that I just love, so let me read it. Top of page 309. Indeed, 23andMe includes a disclaimer about this possibility, more about the possibility in a moment, in their terms of service. That's the I agree to the terms of service that we all check yes, even though we didn't read them. And the sentence is, once you obtain your genetic information, capitalized, meaning it's a defined term in the agreement, the knowledge is irrevocable. So what do you think of the word irrevocable in that legal sentence, Danielle?
Well, at the time, I consulted with some college friends of mine who are attorneys to ask them what the legal sense of this meant. And they said, well, this is actually kind of silly. Um, I think, I think what they're trying to warn people of is that you usually can't unlearn knowledge. But I also think that there's an implication that the knowledge that you're buying this commodity, which is knowledge about yourself, and it's capitalized. So, genetic information, capital G, capital I, or capital N or capital K for knowledge. Um, and so it's both unreturnable you can't just return it to the store and unlearn what you've learned about yourself, and also that the knowledge itself is somehow fixed and immutable. Um, and that is simply not the case, because even in the case of genetic information, um, you receive some kind of report and it's kind of crude. I mean, you're told certain things in relation to what they do is they pick a data set of individuals who identify as being Irish, right? Like geographic origin. And so people have had the experience of that information changing over time as the company alters their data set.
Yes, in fact, when I did 23andMe, because the curiosity was just gnawing at me, I came back 97% Jewish, 3% Eastern European. I'm still trying to make sense of those words, and maybe at some point, genetic insight will help me with that. But let's see if there are any questions, because I really would like to come back to the larger question of what do we do with information that we gain that is not actionable. You and I talked about the early days of the BRCA1 gene diagnosis, which I think of very much as a metagnostic event that in 1994, when I was starting my bioethics training at Columbia and Einstein, was a label that was non-actionable. There was no intervention that could be responsibly indicated just from that genetic test result. But let's park that for now. And Sarah, are there any questions?
Thank you, David. So you talked a lot about metagnosis as it relates to the completed life, and thank you for tying that in, especially as it relates to illness and family, and really the shift in identity potentially for someone to go from a human person with a name, a sense of identity as it's been characterized by the life that they've lived, to that of a patient, someone who medical treatment may be required, even if they choose to refuse that treatment, where they may be hooked up to a morphine drip or a feeding tube or a ventilator. And so, this question of how metagnosis relates to that identity shift is really profound from what you're sharing. And this also ties in with a question from Gary Wiederspan. He says, as our self-concepts have to adjust to limitations that occur toward the end of life, we face an ongoing challenge of deciding who we are when what we can do declines. What are your tips for updating a positive self-image once the shift has occurred?
That's such a wonderful question, and it also contains so much wisdom within it. The premise of the question is that there should be a way, or how do we do this? And it reminds me, I had this wonderful internist for many years who just betrayed me by moving to New Hampshire. But we were talking about his whole thing. One of his he enjoyed caring for people over the course of large portions of their lives, and so I can't remember how it came up, but we were talking about, like, let's say, somebody has a knee injury or something, and this goes to you were saying, David, about, I think, the body over the course of life and how it can serve you, and the question being that the person in the role of the patient might ask is, well, when is it going to be the same as it was before? When is it going to be as good as new? Which is what sociologist Arthur Frank calls the restitution narrative, which is very powerful and prescriptive in our culture. And the answer is never, because we're actually never the same as we were before, because our bodies and ourselves are constantly changing, and we are all aging all the time, right? But many of us, again, do not live with full conscious awareness of this reality, right? So I know this is a little more abstract, but I do think that bringing that awareness into what might seem to be like the more dramatic changes that we often face towards the end of life can be helpful, because those of us who are fortunate enough to reach that stage of life without having faced it before are just some of many, are some of us. There are many people who face that reality of dramatic changes in one's physical capacity at any point in life. In the disability studies and activism communities, there's this term temporarily able-bodied or temporarily able-minded. That we're only ever, at best, temporarily, quote unquote, able-bodied or minded. And so, again, by understanding it as a spectrum, then maybe that can be helpful in that situation. And that, as it always is, the goal is to have whatever kind of quality of life one can have given a certain set of circumstances. That it's not like, okay, now I can't do this specific thing that I could do in the past, therefore I cannot have a quality of life. No, it's a renegotiation of the terms of possibility. David, did you want to add to that?
I do. I think what we do in clinical bioethics is to help people along to understand a redefinition or reinvention of what is possible in life and what is rewarding in life. And I can see using metagnosis as a tool to help people understand that our insights about what disease and injury and disability or loss of ability means for them, both in the negative and the positive sense, is an important responsibility we have. It will, I think, metagnosis will, I think, become part of the standard of care for clinical ethicists, that this will be a framing that we have a responsibility to share with patients and families and clinicians that we consult with, so that they can better understand both the gravity and the significance of a revelation in diagnosis and what positive impact that can have on how they understand the remainder of what for them will be their complete life.
And if I can if I'll just make a sandwich to speak again after you have, I think that, again, to understand it along a spectrum, that really questioning, interrogating the importance of quote unquote normalcy can be helpful, deeply helpful to people at many stages of life. And in the book, I quote this wonderful Scottish ophthalmologist and vision scientist, Gordon Dutton, who routinely diagnoses very unusual cognitive visual impairments in children. They get referred to him because they haven't received diagnoses elsewhere. And he says to them, quote, well, you're normal because normal is what I am and normal is what you are. You yourself, you're normal, therefore you've just got a different normal. And this is very profound, because It's shifting the goal and the sense of identity around the lived experience of that particular person. And as David was just saying, if clinical ethicists and clinicians have this as a shared understanding with the people that they're charged to care for, then often it can release us from saying, okay, well, now I'm no longer within this bucket of normal, so there's no point. But again, that this can be helpful at any point along life's journey, right? And that we can understand the lessons that we learn from other kinds of conditions and situations and bring them into end of life decision making as well.
Which just reinforces the importance, the centrality, as I often discuss with a friend who's with us today, of the irrelevance or the overstatement of the value of normal. Right? Normal is not. It's not something to aspire to. It's just descriptively a point along a spectrum.
Thank you both. And now I'd like to turn to Susan Kersheimer, who is in the audience. And for everyone else who would like to ask a question over video, you're welcome to. So turning to Susan first, but if you would like to ask a question, please turn on your video and raise your hand. All right, Susan, over to you.
Can you hear me? I'll just keep my camera off if that's okay.
Sure.
So Danielle, David, and Sarah, thank you so much for having this amazing program. I am David's friend that he was just talking about, and he is part of the comment that I would like to make, which is that, I don't know, maybe 9 months ago, on the day that I was diagnosed with lymphoma, I was speaking with him about this very unexpected diagnosis that was found completely by accident. And, there was shock and fear, but my initial response was just this overwhelming feeling of gratitude that this had been found, and the implications of what my life could have been had it not been discovered. And as it turns out, it was a condition that I had had for some time, unbeknownst to me. And the way that it was described is it's generally uncurable, which is really not what you want to hear when you get a diagnosis like that. But it really challenged my my previous understanding of what the rest of my life was going to look like. And it threw in this unpredictability that is both challenging and a gift in many ways. And I remember talking with David that day and on many days since then that this is an opportunity to bring your priorities into clearer focus and to live your best life. And that this is not an opportunity to be squandered. And Danielle, your framing of this is so interesting to me because one of the challenges that I've had is with cancer. That's a condition that we tend to look in a very binary way. You're either in remission and you're cancer-free, or you have this active disease. And that's really not the case with me. This is probably a lifelong condition that I will live with. And so the knowledge of this condition has, for me, in some ways been very positive. And I've chosen to use it as a motivator and as an advisor. But when other people hear the word cancer, they think of it as something that is just a terrible, horrible, all-consuming event that is going to end badly. So I was just wondering what your take is on that. And again, I want to thank you for this conversation.
Susan,
well, first, let me say thank you, Susan,
yeah.
and hi. First, let us share that Susan is doing remarkably well for someone who has undergone a course of treatment for lymphoma, so put your minds at ease. But I really want to tie Susan's comments into our earlier discussion, Danielle, about the positive aspect of a metagnosis, when you've sort of been aware of something different about yourself, but now can name it, define it, and put it in its proper context. Because in bioethics, we very much focus on the notion that it is the scarcity of life, it is our mortality that gives all of our days, weeks, and years value. That's what Susan's talking about. How can we use metagnosis to expand that insight, that realization?
Yes, well, first, let me just add, Susan, thank you for sharing your story with us even a little bit. I send you good wishes for your health. And you have to be careful in, not being cliche or trivializing, because especially with cancer, there's this, like, this goes back again to, these prescriptive kind of cultural scripts of like, oh, well, and so, so now you've, that there should always be something kind of revelation that accompanies it, that you have to, grow as a person when it comes. And of course, that would to slap that on to anybody who's facing that would be to trivialize and flatten what is a experience that's unique to each person, as we began to hear with you. But what you said about how the binary of cancer or cancer-free is one that for you becomes apparent as being not accurate it does fit with a lot of other metagnostic experiences in various different contexts. So whether it's, oh, okay, well, so I have Asperger's syndrome, but really, let's start thinking about, like, what is the role of normalcy here? And should it really be pathologized? What does it mean? Why are some things pathologized and why are some things not? So then the boundary between normal, quote unquote, normalcy, and then whatever the condition is becomes much fuzzier in a productive way when people are facing these realities for themselves or for their loved ones. And I think that while it's painful to confront other people's reactions that, oh, well, you have cancer, so you have cancer, that it's a binary, that ultimately the hope is that that those understandings can be made more nuanced. And I don't like to counter story, but I had told David that I would acknowledge that the memoir aspect of my own book. And so in the first couple of chapters, I talk about my big metagnostic experience was that I learned in adulthood that I have a big whopping visual field defect. So my vision is only like this instead of like this. That led me into this whole journey in which I realized that actually it's not black and white. And I have unconscious vision in my so-called blind hemifields. It's a whole thing, basically, that vision itself is much more nuanced than many of us realize. And in fact, Gordon Dutton, who I quoted a few minutes ago, I spoke with him at one point and he was very helpful. And I said, well, it's frustrating because people seem to have this reductive notion. They ask, well, is there vision or is there not? And he says, and his response was, well, basically you have to tell them that they're talking rubbish because nothing is in black and white. Everything's in shades of gray. And so, reanalyze your own life before you start saying anything to me. And I think that maybe like that writ large will be the path forward for all of us, and to bring that sensitivity to others as well.
I would just add that in these moments, I often think of the first giraffe born with the long neck, who would have felt like the outlier without having the insight that she or he was going to be the only survivor and their offspring. And so be it. Call different ability what you want. It's really just different. Sarah?
Judy has a question. Judy, I'll go ahead and unmute you. Go ahead.
As I've been listening to this very, very interesting conversation between David, who I know well, and Danielle, who I know a bit, I've been thinking about the work I do in counseling, advising, talking with folks who are trying to sort out end-of-life options. And I continuously come up against, for me, something that's sort of familiar, but I'm wondering, Danielle, if you can put it in to your language and the perspective of what you're looking at and understanding, because I'm not sure how to do that, and I think it would be helpful. So I frequently find patients who say to me, this is what I'm going to do. I know it's going to be X because I've always believed it'll be X, and I want information about how to implement X. And part of our discussion and the journey we make together is me trying to help them consider the possibility of a different lived experience, right? So you intellectually think you know exactly what your choice is going to be, and then you are living a different experiential reality, and it informs a different kind of decision. But you have to be open to that as a possibility as you're making this journey. So how would you help me understand it in your language?
Yes. You know, I was going to bring this up earlier, but so if we just back up for a second, the question of identity is a philosophical, you know, been approached through every avenue of life, right? But one way that people have thought about it is through philosophy, and to say, well, what do we mean by personal identity? And one of the classic contemporary texts is Derek Parfit, who comes along and says, actually, it's kind of irrelevant, and he gets at it by introducing some thought experiments and then showing that this question of then, well, I mean, they're thought experiments about, like, you know, whether, you know, if your brain is split into two or two are merged into one, right? And then the question is, well, so, you know, are these the same, you know, clone, all this kind of stuff, are these the same people or not? Do they share an identity or not? And where he arrives at with this is to say, we have these paradoxes with these thought experiments, and what that demonstrates is that the notion of personal identity is not really relevant to us. It's not really fitting. And he winds up with a different model, one where he says what's really important is this question of psychological continuity. So we don't have to get in the weeds on that, but I was teaching this recently, and a student preemptively said, why are we talking about this? Like, how is this relevant to bioethics? But I think it is relevant because what you're describing, Judy, has to do with how you know, if you're making, you know, if you're writing an advanced directive, the premise there is that your present self has a claim on your future self, that there's continuity between them, and that you're giving credence to your present self because you imagine that there's going to be cognitive decline, and so you're better equipped now to make that decision, right? And I think what you're you know, trying to suggest to the people you're working with is to say, well, you're going to be different, but what if you have lived experience, which is, you know, you're not unhappy, you don't have the cognitive capacities you do now, but you might think that makes you less of a self, but maybe not, right? Is that, oh, you're muted.
Judy, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, it's not so much, no, I'm not talking about people who've lost capacity, and that's a whole different situation. No, I'm talking about people who retain capacity, and they have some devastating diagnosis, right?
Oh, I got you, yeah.
And so now it's like, oh my God, I got this diagnosis, therefore I'm going to do X, Y, or Z. I'm going to do, you know, my definition of how I'm going to be in control is only this.
Right.
And what I'm trying to do is open that possibility up to other options along the way.
Okay, I got you. Thanks for the clarification. I think that the examples have a lot in common, though, whether it's cognitive decline or not, because so if I translate this into the framework that I'm proposing, as you asked me to do, then the premise of metagnosis is the meta change part, which is to say that no, it's not isolated to these instances. Actually, we're always already changing. We're always already changeable, even if you haven't had this kind of revelation oh my God, I realize I have lifelong ADHD or whatever. It could always happen. You could always find out something about yourself that you didn't know before that would change your understanding of your own identity and your place in the world vis-a-vis others and your own capacities and so forth. And so if you have that as the premise, then maybe that's helpful if somebody's really just trying to hold on to a fixed sense of, well, I can only have good quality of life if I am able-bodied in the way that I am right now, or able-minded in the way that I am right now. And to say, no, that's actually a pipe dream, because we're always changing. Right? Does that make sense? Oh, you're still muted. Yeah.
There is some echo, so I muted you, Judy. Any
Thank you.
Hi, Judy. Well, I would just say, in response to Judy, and you know, we don't have to go down the ship of Theseus polemic about identity to understand that part of our job as bioethics clinicians is to help people beyond that binary notion of I was my normal then, and now I'm this new normal, which is this sick person, and the only choice I have is to get away from this sick person, even if that means I have to end my life to do it. That's always been the essence of clinical bioethics. But I think metagnosis gives us a language, literally gives us a term to describe this phenomenon as being something that we understand, that we know has always existed, that we can share with the patients that we consult with. It is entirely understandable. I didn't say normal, Susan, but it is entirely understandable that you are feeling the way you are today. But we know from prior experience that there is a level of understanding of the revelation that is this diagnosis that will come later. And so let me describe to you other patients that I have worked with who were feeling exactly as you do at the moment, or in the moments around the diagnosis, right? Not everyone is going to have Susan's experience of relief and empowerment, and we know that, but we can describe to our patients that there's this metagnostic sense that this is part of a continuum that we understand and that we can help them with. And it's
Right.
the that we can help you with part that becomes even more sort of tangible with this notion of metagnosis.
Yes, and to continue that the thought, Judy, you used the term journey, and I think that your premise, if you're working with somebody, is that, well, this is a journey, and not in some kind of, like, you know, cliched way, but that it's an ongoing journey, and again, to understand it as such is already to do so much work to be helpful to people, and that and to it also contains within it an acknowledgement of how challenging that is, facing the unknown, facing change, and people need acknowledgement in order to then open to possibility. Nothing comes without acknowledgement. If you're not acknowledged, then you're just shut down.
Thank you.
And this is, I'm going to seize this as a segue back to the discussion that I want us to include. People need to also understand the limits of their insight at the moment of metagnosis in order to understand that other things are not only possible but likely as we gain better perspective. So I want to now bring our conversation back to the historical lesson of the BRCA1 genetic diagnosis for predisposition, interesting word, for breast cancer, when it first popped on the scene as a technical matter in the early to mid 90s. And as I said, I was just in my bioethics training, which started in 1994. 27 years ago today, or this year, when this test came out, and we were vigorously debating whether this test this genetic test should even be offered, because there was nothing you could do with the information, right? If we gave patients this information, and I'm using the phrase, if we gave as a gift or a possession advisedly, if we gave patients this information, then what could we tell them that they could do with it? And if there was nothing we could tell them that they could do with it, why burden them with the diagnosis? Of course, fast forward 27 plus years, and it is thanks to the people who had the test then, so who we knew were diagnosable with the genetic description. Let's not call it a condition, because it's only, in fact, a predisposition. We can correlate those who had the test early when they were asymptomatic to those who developed breast cancer and those who didn't, so that now the BRCA1 and 2 diagnosis or determination is clinically actionable. And that is part of this metagnostic process, right? Is taking the delayed understanding of the disease from this one little data point. You have this difference in your genetic makeup from other people, call them the others normal or not, and now we can do something with that information. You are deriving the benefit, the gift of all of those who came before you's willingness to accept this genetic information, which was not at the time of diagnosis. And now it can be a tool for diagnosis. So I think that's part of what we can do for our patients, Judy. And I think now we really have to, we ought to.
Well, and that goes back to the relationality question, because in this case, we're saying like the significance of the information, and I just dropped in the 23andMe disclaimer language for those who are interested. The significance of the information in the case that you just described, David, is so striking in this regard. It changes dramatically, right? So what it means for, you know, understanding, because when we started talking about this, I didn't understand why this would be problematic, because I didn't know the history that the clinical significance wasn't known originally, right? Mm-hmm. So that's a change in knowledge. The clinical significance becomes known, and then you still face a conundrum. I mean, a lot of women face this question of whether they want to know or not, right? And it's still a challenge. But understanding that the significance changes depending upon the circumstance is integral to this, because that is always the case, and that the circumstances are changing, and we cannot predict what's going to happen in the future, much as we might hope to.
Let me just say, from a clinical perspective, we still wrestle with helping patients understand a BRCA diagnosis in the context of a decision prior to symptoms of pursuing a bilateral radical hysterectomy, which, you know, Angelina Jolie brought into popular conversation with her
mastectomy. I don't. Most women don't have two uteruses, but yeah, mastectomy. And
what did I say?
It's a bilateral hysterectomy.
Oh, did I say hysterectomy?
I was just thinking, like, well, what if somebody thought that was clinically accurate, and then we would be responsible, you know?
That is, in fact, hysterical. Yes. I think my mind must have been going back to our discussions about uterine transplant at that moment. Anyway, yeah. So yeah, right. I think we still have a challenge there.
We have one more question. I think we have time to get to before we wrap up today. This is from Dean. He's wondering about compression and decompression of mortality. He's wondering, is one better off never knowing how life's journey ends, and then you experience the ultimate compression of mortality at the end, versus how do we decide about decompression of mortality, which I take you to mean, Dean, that having advance notice of your mortality is a boon rather than a harm.
Elongating the discussion. That's an important question, Dean, for which there is no universally applicable answer, and this goes to the point that Danielle and I were making earlier about this metagnostic information being useful only from an ethical perspective to the individual to make decisions about their individual case, because we ought not to impose upon people either a compressed or an elongated experience of the inevitability of mortality. Danielle, you said earlier that you understand your mortality in the abstract, but you haven't sort of internalized it. That is your prerogative, right? And none of us in clinical ethics or medicine ought to be messing with that.
Well, I mean, I think it just raises it as a question and an individual question. I mean, if somebody came to me and said, you know what, you really need to, actually think more consciously about this because you need to, make decisions on that basis, then that's perfectly fine. But I just, again, I know this is really belaboring the point, but to tie it into the whole spectrum of metagnostic experiences, there isn't any one answer. I mean, when I had my visual field revelation, one of the things I asked myself, and I talked also with my mother about this, is whether or not I would have been better off knowing before. And I actually think I would not have been better off knowing. I mean, I adapted, I grew up, and wasn't considered to have a visual impairment, and I'm not making any judgments for anybody else, but I basically I see it as an open question. Would the knowledge net have been more helpful or harmful to me growing up? Once you have it, you can't make that, you can't give back the information, as we were saying earlier. But that's
goes
something
to the
that
23andMe point,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
You can't unknow something.
Yeah.
And this raises the insight that we ought to stress about the difference between observable and non-observable disabilities, that word in quotes, different abilities or deviations from normal, because observable differences have to be dealt with entirely differently than your visual field issues, my ADD, my lack of range of motion in my hip, right? We need to acknowledge that those which are identifiable and observable at large require a different sensitivity.
Yes, very much so.
Wow, that was an hour and a half that went quickly. Sarah, back to you.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Danielle. Let me share the slides one more time so that for those who are intrigued now to go read Danielle's book may do so. Let me just share in a moment.
Yes, and let me comment while that's coming up that the treatment of the language from the 23andMe disclaimer at page 308 and 309 is much more interesting and significant than the little excerpt that Danielle posted in the chat box. So you should still treat yourself to the unicorn. And by the way, it's funny that you chose a unicorn, because I tell my medical students, contrary to the age-old instruction, when you hear hoofbeats, think of horses, not zebras. I've tweaked that for my own purposes in teaching. And I tell my medical students, when you hear hoofbeats, first think of horses, then think of zebras. Never discount the possibility of unicorn as a way
Yes.
of keeping an open mind. So the unicorn is wonderfully symbolic. And so buy the book, daniellespencer.com/metagnosis, or at your favorite local bookstore, they can order it for you.
Yes, thank you so much. And that's my website, where I posted a couple different purchase links and also links to other reviews and events that I've done about the book for those who are interested. And thank you all so much. This was wonderful.
Thank you, Danielle, for joining us. It's a delight to hear about what you've been thinking about these past few years, and congratulations on your book. It's truly wonderful to have both of you here in conversation today. It's been so enlightening to me, and I think to our audience as well, at the Completed Life Initiative. So thank you both. So, as David mentioned, you can check out Danielle's website for more information. I'm sure the book is available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, the major book retailers. And it's
Or your
published.
local bookstore. My daughter insists that I stress local bookstores. Thank you, Emily.
Absolutely. Thank you. So with that said, we had a enlightening discussion. Thank you again. So please, check us out on social media. Completedlife.org is our website, as many of you know. If you're joining us for the first time, welcome. And please join our mailing list to stay tuned for further upcoming events. Our next event will be on May 20th, which is Thursday, from 5 to 6 p.m. at Town Hall on medical aid in dying and the legal and medical implications of medical aid in dying in Canada. So we will be joined by Jocelyn Downey and Stephanie Green, the former being a lawyer and litigator for medical aid in dying in Canada, and the latter being a MAID provider. So very much looking forward to that upcoming event. A round of applause to you, Danielle and David, for your contribution today. Thank you. And for all of you in the audience and watching the playback, thank you for being here. Thank you for watching, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Be well. Bye-bye.